The police station buzzed with activity, officers sipping coffee and chatting, until a black woman stepped up to the front desk. She had a simple question, but the cop behind the counter smirked, annoyed by her presence. Without warning, he grabbed his coffee and threw it in her face. He expected her to flinch, to cry out, to back down, but she didn't. She simply wiped her face, adjusted her coat, and looked him dead in the eye. And at that moment, his fate was sealed. Lily Moore walked into the police station with a quiet confidence, her dark jeans and simple blouse blending her into the background. No one paid her much attention. Officers moved around her, talking loudly, shuffling papers, sipping coffee. Business as usual. But she wasn't here for business as usual. She was here to see exactly how things worked when no one knew who she was. She approached the front desk, where Officer Jake Turner, a burly man with cold, calculating eyes, sat behind a computer. His uniform was slightly unbuttoned, his sleeves rolled up to show off forearm tattoos. He didn't bother looking up. "What do you need?" he muttered, tapping at his keyboard. "I'd like to file a theft report," Lily said, her voice firm but calm. Jake snorted, finally glancing at her. His gaze flickered over her. A quick, dismissive scan. "Another one, huh?" He let out a sharp, mocking laugh, making sure the other officers nearby heard him. "Let me guess. A phone. A purse? Hate to break it to you, lady, but those things never turn up again." Lily met his gaze evenly. "I want to file a report. That is my right." Her unwavering tone seemed to annoy him. He leaned back in his chair, grabbed his coffee, and took a slow sip before standing up. The room grew quieter, subtle tension creeping in as a few officers turned to watch. No one stepped in. No one stopped what was about to happen. "Listen," Jake said, stepping closer, lowering his voice to a threatening growl. "People like you should know your place. We've got real crimes to deal with, not your petty little problems." Before Lily could respond, he tilted his coffee cup and flung the scalding liquid at her face. A collective gasp swept through the station as the coffee splashed against her cheek and dripped onto her blouse. A young officer, Chris Meyer, clenched his fists, his face burning with anger, but Jake shot him a sharp look, daring him to speak. No one did. Lily took a slow breath, feeling the heat sting her skin. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. Instead, she reached up, wiped her face with her hand, and smiled. "Thank you," she said, her voice even, controlled, "for showing me exactly how things work around here." Then she turned and walked out. The silence in the station was deafening. Jake smirked, shaking his head. Another nobody put in their place. But 2 hours later, when he was summoned to the briefing room, that smirk disappeared. The entire force was seated, waiting. Jake strolled in casually, taking a seat in the back, arms crossed, still in control, until she walked in. Lily Moore entered, head held high, radiating authority. A few officers glanced at her in confusion, recognizing her as the woman Jake had humiliated earlier. Then she spoke. "Good morning." She paused, scanning the room. "I understand it's been an eventful day. Allow me to introduce myself." She stepped forward, placing a leather folder on the table. "I'm Lily Moore, your new chief of police." A heavy, suffocating silence crushed the room. Jake froze. His hands clenched the arms of his chair. The color drained from his face. "Oh no." "Oh yes," Lily said, turning toward him, her gaze sharp as a blade. "I've spent the last 2 weeks observing how this station operates. And what I've seen?" She exhaled slowly. "A disgrace." Jake tried to compose himself, but his mind was racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the one in control. He was the one people feared. Not anymore. Chris Meyer, sitting a few seats away, stole a glance at Jake. The power dynamic had shifted forever. For the first time in his career, Jake Turner wasn't the one holding power, and he knew it. Officer Linda Carson had been with the force for 15 years. She prided herself on being sharp, respected, and, in her own mind, always in control. Tonight, as she sat in her patrol car on a quiet Columbus street, she was bored. The city had settled into its evening lull. No action, no excitement. Then, she spotted it. A sleek black luxury sedan gliding through an intersection ahead. Linda's eyes narrowed. It was the kind of car that screamed wealth, power, and status. But it was also a car she didn't often see in this part of town. She followed it, observing its movements. Everything seemed ordinary, until she noticed the turn signal wasn't used. A small thing, barely worth stopping someone over, but Linda had learned something over the years. Small stops led to big discoveries. Her instincts told her this driver didn't belong here. Flipping on her cruiser lights, she watched as the sedan's brake lights flared instantly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. The driver pulled over with an eerie smoothness. That was unusual. Most people hesitated for a moment. Anxious. Unsure. This driver. Calm. Too calm. Linda put her cruiser in park, grabbed her flashlight, and adjusted her belt. Before stepping out, she did something she rarely did. She double-checked her badge. Something about this stop felt different. She walked to the driver's side, shining her light into the vehicle. Inside sat a middle-aged black man, neatly dressed in a tailored navy suit. He had a short, well-groomed beard, and his hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. He looked like a man who belonged in that car. That unsettled her. "License and registration," Linda ordered, her voice firm. The man blinked once, then nodded. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he was used to these situations. That irritated her. "What's the reason for the stop, officer?" he asked, his voice even, controlled. Linda felt a flicker of annoyance. That wasn't the tone she expected. There was no nervousness, no quick, stammering explanations. "You failed to use your turn signal back there," she said, watching him carefully. The man reached into his glove compartment with the kind of patience that suggested he had done this before. Too many times before. He retrieved his ID and registration, then handed them over without a word. Linda took them, glancing down. Judge Daniel Richards. Her stomach twisted. A federal judge. For a brief moment, Linda hesitated. But pride kicked in. It didn't matter who he was. She was the officer here. She was the one in control. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered. Judge Richards raised an eyebrow. "For a turn signal violation?" Linda stiffened. She could feel eyes on her now. A few bystanders had stopped to watch. Some had pulled out their phones. "I said step out of the vehicle," she repeated, her voice sharper. Richards exhaled, then unbuckled his seatbelt. He pushed open the door and stood up slowly. He was tall, his presence commanding, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough to make eye contact with someone standing nearby. "Would you mind continuing to record, please?" he said to a bystander. Linda felt heat rush to her face. This wasn't going the way she had planned. "You think that's going to help you?" she sneered, trying to regain control. "No," Richards said, looking her in the eye. "But it will help you." The tension was suffocating. Linda could feel it. The onlookers could feel it. And then Richards dropped the bombshell. "I was on my way to meet the chief of police. Would you like to follow me there?" The weight of those words hit her like a punch to the gut. The color drained from her face. The people recording? Their eyes widened. The cameras zoomed in. Oh no. Oh yes. Within hours the video would go viral. By morning, Officer Linda Carson would find herself under investigation. And by the end of the week, she wouldn't be wearing that badge anymore. Jeremiah Hastings never imagined his life would change in a single night. One moment, he was marching alongside hundreds of others, holding up a sign that read, "Equality for all." The next, he was slammed against the hood of a police cruiser, handcuffed, and accused of crimes he didn't commit. The peaceful protest had started strong. Chants, speeches, and a march through downtown, demanding justice for victims of police brutality. But then, as always, things turned. Agitators, outsiders, had stormed through, breaking windows and vandalizing stores. The police responded ruthlessly, rounding up protesters indiscriminately. Jeremiah had done nothing wrong. But none of that mattered when he was young, black, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the time his aunt, Velma Hastings, received the call, Jeremiah was already in a holding cell, awaiting trial for destruction of property and resisting arrest. Charges that had no basis in reality. Velma wasn't just any woman. She had spent years fighting for justice, building a reputation as a relentless social worker and advocate. But even she knew what she was walking into as she approached the Fulton County Courthouse the next morning. The courthouse loomed in front of her, its grand columns a symbol of justice tainted by corruption. As she reached the steps, 2 officers blocked her path. Tall, armed, smug. "Can I help you, ma'am?" one of them asked, voice dripping with condescension. His name tag read, Officer Brad Tully. "I'm here for my nephew's hearing," Velma replied, standing her ground. Tully exchanged a smirk with his partner, Officer Carl Dunn. "One of the protesters, huh? Caused a lot of trouble last night." Velma's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. He was exercising his constitutional right. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Dunn shifted, blocking her way completely. "We've had a little too much trouble from folks like you," he muttered, his breath hot against her face. "We'll be keeping an eye on you. Cause trouble, and we'll have you in cuffs before you know it." The threat was clear. They weren't just trying to stop her from entering the courthouse. They wanted to intimidate her. But Velma Hastings had spent her whole life fighting men like them. Instead of arguing, she reached into her bag. Not for her ID, not for her phone, but for a direct line to power. One call. Not to a lawyer. Not to the news. To the FBI. "Agent Carter?" she said, her voice steady. "I need you at Fulton County Courthouse. Now." The two officers exchanged nervous glances, their arrogance starting to crack. Minutes passed. Tully shifted on his feet. Dunn cleared his throat, his bravado waning. Then, the sound of SUVs rolling up the street. Not police cars. Black SUVs, government plates. FBI agents stepped out, their expressions unreadable as they walked straight toward Velma, and then past her, stopping right in front of Tully and Dunn. "Which one of you harassed Ms. Hastings?" one agent asked coolly. The blood drained from Tully's face. Velma folded her arms. "Well, do you want to tell them, or should I?" The two officers stumbled over their words, suddenly unsure, suddenly powerless. By the end of the day, Jeremiah was free. The charges were dropped, and the officers who had once thought themselves untouchable, they were under federal investigation. Velma Hastings had shaken the system, and she was just getting started. The dealership gleamed under the midday sun, its glass windows reflecting rows of sleek, high-end vehicles. Inside, customers in designer suits and expensive dresses admired luxury cars, engaging in quiet conversations with polished salespeople. James Carter walked in alone, his worn boots leaving faint traces of mud on the pristine tiled floor. His faded denim overalls and sun hat instantly made him stand out in a showroom filled with people who looked like they belonged. From across the room, Mark Peterson, a smooth-talking salesman in his mid-30s, spotted James and smirked. Adjusting his tie, he strode toward him, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. With a fake, plastered-on smile, Mark spoke. "Sir, I think you might be lost. The used cars lot is down the street." A few nearby customers snickered, pretending not to watch. James didn't flinch. He had seen men like Mark before. "I'm here for this one," James said, pointing to the most expensive car on the showroom floor. A sleek black luxury sedan with chrome accents that gleamed under the lights. Mark let out a short, incredulous laugh. "This one? Are you sure?" He crossed his arms, glancing at James's overalls as if waiting for him to realize his mistake. James nodded. "I'd like to buy it." The smirk on Mark's face grew. "Well, sir, this isn't just any car. It's a top-tier model, equipped with the latest technology, handcrafted leather seats, and a price tag most people wouldn't believe." He chuckled, openly mocking James now. "It's a little out of reach." A few customers turned their heads, pretending not to eavesdrop, but the amusement in their eyes was unmistakable. James remained calm. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, slightly worn envelope. He placed it firmly on the table between them. Mark frowned, the arrogance in his face briefly faltering as James slowly peeled back the flap, revealing crisp stacks of $100 bills inside. James looked Mark in the eye. "Will this be enough, or do you need more?" The room went silent. A few nearby customers exchanged uneasy glances. The smirk was gone from Mark's face. He cleared his throat, trying to recover. "Sir, it's not just about cash," he said quickly. "There's financing, insurance, maintenance. Cars like this require a certain kind of commitment." James tilted his head slightly, studying Mark with the patience of a man who had weathered storms bigger than this one. Just then, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Lisa Turner, the dealership manager, had been watching the exchange from behind her desk. A woman in her 40s, she was known for her sharp instincts, and she did not like what she had just witnessed. Mark hesitated. "Oh, no problem at all, Lisa. Just making sure we're not wasting anyone's time." Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly. She turned to James. "Sir, are you looking to make a purchase today?" James nodded. "Yes, but I don't think your salesman believes I can afford it." Lisa exhaled through her nose, already annoyed. "Mark, step into my office. Now." Mark's face drained of color. Lisa turned back to James. "Sir, my apologies for his behavior. Let me personally assist you." As she led James toward her office, one of the customers whispered, "Who is that guy?" Another customer, still staring at the stacks of cash, muttered, "I don't know." But I think that salesman just screwed up big time. Because what Mark didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to ask, was that James Carter wasn't just a farmer. He was one of the wealthiest landowners in the entire state. And by the time James drove off in his brand-new luxury car, Mark Peterson no longer had a job. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the quiet stretch of highway, the heat shimmering off the asphalt. Matthew Evans, a wealthy businessman in his late 70s, sat alone in his silver Mercedes, tapping his thumb impatiently against the steering wheel. The car, sleek and powerful, now sat helpless on the side of the road with a flat tire. Matthew had built his empire in finance, used to control, used to power, but today, he found himself at the mercy of a simple mechanical failure. He had tried calling roadside assistance, but his phone had no signal out here. Frustration bubbled in his chest. Just as he began resigning himself to the wait, he spotted a young boy walking toward him. Maybe 13 or 14, with worn-out sneakers and a faded t-shirt. The boy had an air of quiet determination. His steps were sure, his posture upright. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked. Matthew studied him. He was used to people offering help with expectations attached. Tips, rewards, something. But the boy's expression was genuine, unbothered. "Yes," Matthew admitted. "You wouldn't happen to know how to change one, would you?" The boy nodded confidently. "My grandpa taught me last summer. If you've got a spare, I can fix it." Surprised, Matthew opened the trunk, pulling out the spare tire and tools. The boy immediately got to work, his hands moving with practiced ease. Matthew watched, fascinated. The boy didn't hesitate, didn't fumble. He worked swiftly, focused, and efficient. There was no idle chatter, no attempt to impress, just a quiet confidence that Matthew had seen in only a handful of men in his lifetime. When the boy finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back with a satisfied smile. "All done," he said simply. Matthew reached into his wallet and pulled out a few crisp bills, holding them out. "Here, I really appreciate your help." But the boy took a step back, shaking his head. "No, sir. I don't need anything. Just happy to help." Matthew froze, staring at him. That didn't happen. No one refused money, especially not someone who clearly didn't have much. "What's your name, son?" Matthew asked, lowering the money. "Elijah," the boy said. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away, heading back down the road, his shoulders relaxed, his steps light. Matthew sat there for a long moment, stunned. Something about the encounter wouldn't let go of him. That night, sitting in the vast loneliness of his mansion, Matthew couldn't shake the memory of Elijah's quiet dignity. The next morning, he made a decision. He tracked the boy down, asking around town until he found the small, modest home where Elijah lived with his mother and younger siblings. The house was worn but tidy, and when Matthew knocked on the door, a woman in her early 40s answered. She looked tired but kind, her sharp eyes filled with curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked. Matthew cleared his throat. "Good morning. I met your son yesterday. He helped me on the side of the road." She smiled softly. "That sounds like Elijah. I wanted to thank him properly," Matthew said. "And, if it's all right, I'd like to offer him something more." She hesitated. "What do you mean?" Matthew glanced around the humble home, then back at her. "I mean a future. Education, financial support, whatever he needs to succeed." Her breath hitched. "You'd do that? For a boy you just met?" Matthew smiled. "Your son reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Kindness should be repaid with kindness." And with that, Elijah's life changed forever. Not because he asked for help, but because he had given it without expecting anything in return. The private terminal gleamed under the morning sun, a hub of quiet luxury where the wealthy traveled in comfort. Chauffeurs stood by sleek black cars, pilots prepped aircraft, and exclusivity filled the air. Dr. Elena Harper stepped out of her black luxury sedan, her tailored blazer sharp against the soft silk of her blouse. With an air of effortless confidence, she pulled her luggage toward Gate 5, where her private jet awaited. As she neared the aircraft, a uniformed pilot, Captain Joel Carter, stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cool and dismissive. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I'm here for the flight to Chicago." The captain glanced at her suitcase, then back at her, his lips curling into a smirk. "This is a private flight, ma'am. I think you might be at the wrong gate." Elena's grip tightened on her suitcase handle. "Gate 5, correct?" "It is," Carter said, crossing his arms. "But this jet isn't for commercial passengers. It's for private clients." His tone was firm, laced with condescension. Before Elena could respond, a flight attendant, Aaron, approached with a clipboard. "Is there a problem here?" Aaron asked, glancing between them. "Just a misunderstanding," the captain said dismissively. "She thinks she's on this flight." Elena sighed and reached into her designer handbag, pulling out her phone. A few taps later, she handed it to Aaron. The attendant's expression shifted as she scanned the screen. A beat of silence passed before she quickly masked her surprise. "Well," Aaron said, clearing her throat. "Everything seems to be in order." The captain's smirk vanished. His jaw tightened, irritation creeping into his posture. Elena took one step forward, then turned back to face him directly. "You seem upset," she said smoothly. The captain hesitated, caught off guard. "No, I just—" Elena pulled out a gold-embossed folder from her bag and flipped it open, revealing the bold title inside. Harper Global Aviation. Owner, Dr. Elena Harper. The flight attendant's face paled. The captain's confidence crumbled. Elena's voice was smooth and measured. "I own this jet." Silence. The captain blinked rapidly, realization sinking in. "I think you were saying something about me being lost?" she asked. The attendant stammered, but Elena held up a hand, silencing her. "I don't need excuses." She exhaled, as if deciding something. Then she turned to the captain. "You and the entire crew are fired, effective immediately." The flight crew stood frozen, their careers crumbling in real time. Elena stepped onto her jet, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As the door closed behind her, she left them standing in stunned silence. Their assumptions, their entire perception of power, shattered. Never judge a book by its cover. The night air was crisp as Margaret Hill made her way home, her cane tapping softly against the pavement. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. At 67 years old, she had seen and endured more than most. But tonight, she was just another woman walking home, until Officer Ryan Steele decided otherwise. Ryan sat in his patrol car, watching Margaret with narrowed eyes. She was alone, dressed in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, carrying a small bag. To him, she looked out of place. Maybe she was homeless. Maybe she was up to something. Flipping on his cruiser lights, he pulled up beside her. "Hey!" he barked, stepping out. "Where are you headed?" Margaret paused, then turned slowly to face him. Her calm, steady gaze unsettled him. "I'm walking home, officer," she said simply. Ryan folded his arms, his stance wide. "At this hour? In this neighborhood?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "What's in the bag?" Margaret lifted it slightly, revealing a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and canned goods. "Groceries." Ryan wasn't convinced. He had seen all kinds of people try to play innocent. He stepped closer, towering over her. "Let me see your ID," he demanded. Margaret sighed, reaching into her coat deliberately. She had dealt with men like him before, men who thought a badge made them untouchable. She handed him her ID. He barely glanced at it. "You don't belong here," Ryan muttered, frowning. "I should take you in, just to be safe." Margaret held his gaze, unshaken. "For what crime, officer?" Ryan's jaw tightened. He didn't like her confidence. Then, he made a mistake. He grabbed her arm. Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, her lips curled into a knowing smile. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said softly. Ryan started to laugh, but it died in his throat when he heard it. The deep, rumbling engine of a black SUV. It pulled up smoothly, its government plates gleaming under the streetlights. The door swung open, and two men in tailored suits stepped out. Ryan's grip on Margaret loosened. The men approached, their expressions unreadable. One of them, Agent Thomas Carter, stopped right in front of Ryan, his eyes cold. "Unhand her. Now." Ryan's breath hitched. Who are you?" Margaret gently pulled her arm free, dusting off her sleeve. Then, with a calm smile, she looked at Ryan. "These are my colleagues. I was an FBI agent for 35 years. Ryan's face drained of color. Agent Carter took a step closer. "Officer Steele, you are now under investigation for misconduct. I suggest you get yourself a lawyer." Ryan stumbled back, realizing his career was over before the night had even ended. Margaret adjusted her coat, gave Ryan one last look, then walked toward the SUV. As she climbed inside, she said one final thing. "Next time, Officer Steele, think before you put your hands on someone." The door shut behind her, and as the SUV drove away, Ryan was left standing in stunned silence, his power shattered in an instant. The steps of the courthouse were crowded with people, lawyers, reporters, and citizens moving in and out of the towering building. Among them was Marcus Reed, a middle-aged black man dressed in a crisp suit, his hands gripping the court documents that would finally clear his name. But Officer Greg Dawson didn't care about that. Dawson, a bitter, heavy-set cop with a history of misconduct, had been watching Marcus for weeks, convinced he was one of those guys who got lucky, a black man who thought he could stand tall in a system meant to keep him small. As Marcus stepped onto the sidewalk, Dawson blocked his path. "Where do you think you're going?" he sneered. Marcus met his gaze, unwavering. "Home. I just finished my hearing." Dawson scoffed. "Not so fast. You match the description of someone we've been looking for." A few onlookers stopped, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. One even pulled out a phone. Marcus exhaled slowly. "I just left a courtroom full of attorneys. You really want to do this here?" Dawson's face darkened. Without warning, he shoved Marcus hard, sending his court papers flying. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few people raised their phones, recording. Marcus stumbled, but didn't fall. Instead, he straightened, brushing dust from his suit. His expression didn't change, but his eyes burned with something Dawson should have feared. Then, Marcus pulled out his phone and made one call. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. "I need you here. Now." Dawson laughed. "Calling your little girlfriend? What's she gonna do?" Marcus didn't answer. He simply tucked his phone away and waited. And 5 minutes later they arrived. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the curb, doors swinging open in perfect sync. 6 agents stepped out, all dressed in dark suits, moving with the kind of authority Dawson could only dream of. Then, she emerged. Alexis Reed, FBI special agent in charge, and Marcus's wife. Dawson's cocky smirk vanished. "Agent Reed," one of the men greeted her. "We received your call. Everything's in place." Alexis's gaze locked onto Dawson, and he took a step back before he even realized it. "Officer Dawson," she said coolly, "you just assaulted my husband." In broad daylight, on camera, Dawson's face turned red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I didn't know. You didn't care who he was," Alexis cut in. She turned to one of her agents. "Take him in." Dawson's eyes widened in horror. "What? You can't." The agent stepped forward. "Greg Dawson, you are under investigation for civil rights violations, excessive force, and abuse of power. You are hereby suspended, effective immediately." Dawson's hands shook as they took his badge and gun. His own fellow officers looked away, unwilling to defend him. As he was led toward an FBI vehicle, Dawson turned back to Marcus and Alexis. "This isn't over," he spat. Marcus adjusted his tie. "No, it's not," he said. "By the end of the day, you won't just be suspended. You'll be arrested." Dawson's blood ran cold, and as the SUV doors slammed shut, he finally understood. His worst nightmare had just begun.